Liberty Nation with Tim Donner.
While Democrats continued their impeachment crusade in the increasingly insular, walled-off echo chamber of Washington, D.C., President Trump was on the world stage at the latest NATO Summit near London, which featured the typical array of broadsides from Trump and the likes of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. But did anything get done there? How has NATO changed since Trump burst onto the scene? How has the mission and importance of NATO changed since its formation some 75 years ago? Here to help us answer these questions is LibertyNation.com's man on the ground in the UK, managing editor Mark Angelides. Welcome, Mark.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me on.
Well, always a pleasure. So let's see if we've got this straight. First, Trump is attacked by the globalists for demanding that NATO countries pay their fair share, their agreed upon share. Then later, Trump is attacked for the opposite, refusing to take up arms against another NATO member, Turkey. And this week, Trump is sounding like a great defender of NATO after remarks by the French President Emmanuel Macron that NATO is brain dead. Help us figure all of this out, please.
I'll try my best, Tim. The basic reality seems to be that NATO, in its present form, is in flux for a number of reasons. And I think you can see by the official statement that they put out at the end of the summit that was very much a US-centric, a Trump-centric statement, that NATO is really in a position where it needs America more than America needs NATO. So what they're trying to do is they're having a bit of an identity crisis at the moment.
Well, so NATO was formed in the aftermath of World War II as a collective defense against Soviet communism and the military threat posed by the Soviets and their satellite governments in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. But to what extent did they adapt to the New World Order once the Soviet Union dissolved and the Berlin Wall came crashing down?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Tim. To what extent did they adapt? They didn't, as far as I can tell. They're still operating under the assumption that Russia and the Soviet Union sort of still exists. Obviously, Russia still exists, but the Soviet Union still exists, and that it's as big a threat as other things that NATO really should be focusing on at the moment. But what's happened is that they're stuck in this mindset that it must be this group against the other group. And that's not really the reality that we're seeing across the geopolitical world right now. These aren't the threats. And they failed to essentially keep up with what's happening in the modern world. It seems it's a question of adapt or die, and they're opting for the latter.
Well, that's pretty well stated. But another element implied, if not explicitly stated, in the NATO pact is an economic partnership or alliance between the U.S. and its European allies. But ever since the advent of the European Union, Europe and the U.S. have become economic competitors on energy, most prominently, but many other things. Does this fundamentally change the foundation of this 29-nation alliance?
Well, initially, there was always some competition in terms of who gets the energy, who gets the trade deals. It was always very much a backroom boys club in this kind of thing. But the real thing that I believe is fueling the shakiness, let's call it, of NATO at the moment, it is not the NATO-Trump relationship or the NATO-US relationship, but rather what the European Union is doing. They've set up something called the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or PESCO, which is, for all intents and purposes, it's a European army. And what this is going to be a new form of NATO. Now, if you have all of these individual European Union members, their nations, they have brigades within their army or groups within their own military forces that are under the control of the European Union, then this is essentially another NATO. So instead of, because NATO, as you know, it's all for one and one for all. If one member state is attacked, then they all agree to retaliate. And what the European Union has created is essentially it's an army, whereas if one of the European nations is attacked, one of the European Union nations is attacked, then of course they already have the army in place. So it's a secondary NATO, and this is really undermining the whole thing a lot more than economic competition, I would suggest.
Well, we all know that if a NATO member gets attacked, that it's going to be U.S. weapons, U.S. forces, U.S. military that's going to come to their aid and comfort. We all know that, but of course these other 28 nations like to posture as if it's all sort of level across the board. Now, Mark, Trump famously demanded the 2% defense spending by each of the NATO countries, which they're all signed on to do. What's been the result of Trump's aggressive posture on this?
Well, initially there was obviously pushback, as I'm sure you remember, but really pretty much everybody's gotten in line now. So the increase is in the billions and looking to rise. And it's not as though Trump demands something that is unreasonable in this situation. This is something that was jointly agreed by everybody.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Mark Angelides, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, joining us from his beloved UK.